But I just want to say to the people of the city of Detroit, things are hard right now. There's no denying that. There's no sugarcoating and pretending that things are not hard right now. But I do truly believe that the city's best days are ahead of us. That's going to require all of us to pull together, make some sacrifices, work hard. But keep in mind that in the immortal words of Frederick Douglass, without struggle, there is no progress.
For the best in African American news, it's Michigan Chronicle Online TV.
You're watching a special sit-down, in-depth interview with Detroit City Councilman Kenneth Cockrel Jr., who announced recently that, in fact, he will not be seeking returning to the Detroit City Council.
It's just time, basically. When to kind of set the stage, when I first ran for city council back in 1997, it was never with the intention of getting elected to city council and doing 20 or 30 years on the council. That was not where my head was at. My philosophy was always, I'd like to get on, do a couple of terms, try to make a contribution, and then from there move on. And I've been pretty consistent in that thinking over the years. And even more recently, if I think back to May of 2009, when I was preparing to run again for re-election to the city council, which I did, my thinking was, okay, this is probably going to be the last term. And as I said, I've been consistent in my thinking in that respect all the way up till now. So I believe it's time for me to move on.
And what are you moving up to?
Don't have anything definite lined up as of yet. And I have to emphasize that I'm not resigning. I'm just not seeking re-election. So technically, I've still got the rest of this term to finish out. That means I'm going to be continuing to serve as a member of council until December 31st. In the meantime, I've got a couple irons in the fire. There's a couple things that I've been exploring, and the goal is to solidify something, certainly by the end of the year, so that come December 31st, when I turn the final page on this chapter, I'll be ready to walk into something else and start writing a new chapter.
Should we expect more other council members to exit the stage like yourself?
You know, that's an interesting question, and I'll be candid in saying that even though I talk to pretty much all of my colleagues on a regular basis, I have not spoken to any of my colleagues who have not already announced their intentions about what they plan to do. I know that we've heard that Council members Kenyatta and Council President Pugh are not going to be seeking re-election. I also understand that last week, I was not here for last week's council meeting because I was out of town due to a family commitment. But I understand at that meeting that Councilmember Jenkins announced that she'll be seeking re-election. But I'm not sure where the rest of my colleagues' heads are at on it. I think you'll probably be seeing them go public very shortly because the filing deadline is coming up on May 14th.
You come from a legendary background. Your father was, you know, almost a statesman, if you will, in this town and this city. So you have a strong name recognition. Getting re-elected on the council, one would assume, would have been no problem in the era of council by districts. Do you feel that council by districts really challenges the existing council in terms of their re-election prospects?
I would tend to say no. And I do have some experience actually with districts because even though I've never run in a council district because there haven't been any up until now, prior to being on the Detroit City Council, I was a Wayne County Commissioner. And I served 3 years on the County Commission representing what was then County Commission District 5, basically the southwest part of the city. Personally, I like districts. I support districts. I think the new system offers some great opportunities for the city of Detroit. I don't know that it necessarily challenges any incumbents that want to seek re-election because I do think incumbency has certain advantages. Whether you're talking about running at large or running from a district, it conveys the advantage of being able to raise funds much easier because people tend to say, oh, well, they're already on that legislative body. They're probably a safe bet. I'll support them. So I think the incumbents do have the advantage if they run from districts, but it may not be as great an advantage because the value of name recognition does go down in a district race. There is a much greater possibility and opportunity for grassroots candidates to come in, make a case to the voters, and possibly defeat an incumbent if they campaign and campaign effectively.
Let's let our viewers know you're watching a special sit-down, in-depth interview with Detroit City Councilman Kenneth Cockrel Jr., who announced recently that, in fact, he will not be seeking returning to the Detroit City Council. Let's review the City Council for a minute. You've been a member of this council. This council has, you know, seen it's almost been like ebb and flow, its worst days and its best days and so forth. When you look at the Detroit City Council as an institution, a massive political institution in this town, how would you describe it in terms of the successes and the failures of this legislative body?
Well, you know, it's interesting because I think City Council often gets a lot of heat, sometimes gets a lot of heat from the media. In some cases, that's been deserved. I mean, the reality is if I look at my time on City Council, I've been in 16 years, so I've seen a lot. I have seen some council members who have come in here and wound up facing federal indictments, wound up going to prison, got up to some really bad stuff that brought shame not only to them and their families, but to a certain extent the entire institution of City Council. But I also think one thing about City Council is it tends to be, to a certain extent, and this is, I don't want to turn this into a pity party, but council can be kind of a thankless job because when council does things that may not even be wrong, but may be perceived to be wrong, we get a lot of heat. When we do things right, we don't get a whole lot of people singing our praises. You know, and I'm not, like I said, I don't want to make this a pity party. That comes with the job. And I think if you talk to any elected official at any level of government, they will probably tell you the same thing.
But why do you think this council has received the most attention? It's almost a big league. It gets more attention than the Oakland County Board of Commissioners. It gets more attention than the Wayne County Board of Commissioners.
That's true.
It gets more attention than any other legislative body in the state.
Yeah, well, I think that's because, part of that I think is just because of size. Detroit is the largest city in Michigan, even with the unfortunate massive population loss that we've seen over the past couple decades. Detroit is still by far the largest city in the state. So automatically, based on that, I think there's a tendency, that's the biggest city. There's always stuff happening in a big city at a political level. Let's see what's going on there. Let's follow that. And the reality is also, too, if you look at some of the things that have gone on in city government in recent years, and I don't have to tell you because you're a journalist, I'm a former journalist, it's news. I mean, you got to cover it. I mean, if you look at the whole Kwame Kilpatrick saga, it's history-making stuff. You can't ignore it. You've got to cover it. So for that reason, as well as the other one that I mentioned, I think there's always been a tendency to focus on Detroit. It's like we got a big target on us. But you raise a very valid point, which is that there is a lot that goes on at the county level, not just in Wayne County, but also in Oakland County and Macomb County. And I think it generally tends to be missed by most journalists because they tend to go for the easier target, which is Detroit city government, and increasingly to some extent Wayne County government. I
certainly don't want to make this a soap opera interview, but I want to delve into some media issues here. But just quickly, you know, you've had your moments on council, and perhaps one of the highlights of that moment was somewhat of a political banter, if you will, with former councilman Monica Conyers, who was indicted and sent to prison. And it was all over YouTube. Reflecting back as you get ready to exit this political institution, when you look back at those moments, what do you say?
You know, I don't really even think about it too much. About the only time I ever really even...
But Shrek stands out.
About the only time I ever think about that is when one of those new Shrek movies comes out. And then, because then I know it's like, oh, all right, I'm going to go through it all over again. But other than I don't really even think about it. And the thing that was always funny to me about that situation when it went down, when it happened, is she insulted me by calling me Shrek. I think she forgot the fact that Shrek is the good guy in that movie and in all the sequels that came out. So it's really not the worst insult when you think about it. It was a crazy time, and I don't hold any ill will to Monica, to be perfectly honest. I actually, believe it or not, ran into her about a month ago. I was having lunch with a friend of mine over at the Detroit Seafood Market, and there she was. We chatted briefly, and it was cool. Like I said, I wish her all the best.
So let's contextualize this. Sometimes when council gets explosive, you know, passions run high, and the debates are held, and you know we have the calling of names and so forth. Do you feel that it's taken out of context?
Yeah, I would have to say I don't think it's taken out of context because, as I was saying again, it's news. You know, I mean, the reality is it's news. If I was a producer at a local television station or an editor such as yourself for a weekly or daily newspaper, something like that happens, I'd consider that a story. I think it needs to be covered. I think it needs to be written about. So I wouldn't say it's taken out of context. I think the one thing that I will say, but this is just kind of the nature of the business, is, you know, negative stuff, that tends to be the bread and butter of the media. So it kind of is what it is.
So let's move further down to the era that we are in, the era of an emergency financial manager.
Right.
Just a few feet from your office is Kevin O, Detroit's emergency financial manager. The arrival of this moment and an emergency manager, is it fair to say is an indictment of local leadership in this city?
I would say yes and no. I would say yes because I do think that there were certain opportunities that we as local leaders had that we missed. Even if I look back to the past 2 years, City Council actually, not last year, but the year before that and the year before that, in both of those years, the council actually pushed for cuts to that fiscal year's budget of over $100 million. And I think the mayor, no, I don't think, I know, the mayor fought us in both of those cases. He said that those cuts were too drastic, that it would force them to close parks and to lay off police officers. I believe in retrospect, both the council and the mayor missed an opportunity. The mayor should have recognized that though those cuts were drastic, agreeing to them probably would have put the city in a better place financially right now. And I think the council missed an opportunity because we didn't stick to our guns. We could have actually overrode the mayor and proceeded with those cuts, but the mayor convinced council to not do them. The first year that that happened, I actually listened to the mayor and said, all right, Mr. Mayor, you think it's too much. You want an opportunity to try something different? Okay, we'll give it to you. The next time that that happened, I was one of few council members that actually voted to sustain the cuts, but most of the council actually agreed to go along with the mayor. So the mayor and the council missed an opportunity, I think, 2 years earlier to try to make some moves that probably would have put us in a better place.
So where are we now? Is this a lost decade for us?
Well, I want to finish responding to your question, though, because I do think, though, council and the mayor did miss some opportunities. The reality is you have a lot of structural issues that are beyond our control. They're even going to be beyond Kevin Orr's control, because the reality is while he can restructure certain things, he can't wave a magic wand and get hundreds of thousands of new residents to move into the city of Detroit. He can't wave a magic wand and get dozens of new businesses to come in and open up shop. And that is the real issue. It's been population loss and concentration of poverty. And these are things that ultimately their legislators could only do so much about.
And is this a lost decade for us?
When you say, did you say last or lost?
The lost decade.
Well, you know, I think right now, if you look at what's going on in the city of Detroit, it's kind of like you've got, I heard somebody say something about Detroit that I thought was kind of a good description of Detroit. Is you got two Detroits right now.
A tale of two cities.
Yeah. You've got the one Detroit of course, everybody points to Dan Gilbert because of the huge resources that he's bringing to the table. And he's making some great things happen. You know, I like what I see.
So you have Gilbert's Detroit and the...
You got Gilbert, but also at a smaller level, you've got a lot of young, aggressive, hungry entrepreneurs who are coming into this city, making great things happen. They may not necessarily be getting the press that Gilbert gets, but they're also having a significant impact. But the other Detroit that you still have is a Detroit where you've got a lot of blight, where you've got city services that are underfunded because of population loss that we talked about. We got to figure out some way to eliminate the split personality of Detroit and merge those two faces together. That's what we've got to do, and that's what I think the challenge is.
Let's have a city council session here. When I look at, review at some of the votes that you have voted in throughout the years, one can, I think, say in a very peculiar form, Kenneth Cockrel Jr.'s vote is always unpredictable. It's very difficult to say where he's laying. How would you grade yourself?
No, I think the way you described it is actually, that's a very good characterization, because first off, the approach that I've generally tend to take, really ever since I first got on city council, is I don't telegraph my vote. You know, I mean, what I mean by that is I've seen some elected officials who will say right off the bat, days or maybe even weeks before the vote on an important matter comes up, well, I'm going to vote against this, I don't like it, or I'm going to vote for this, I support it. I generally don't do that, and part of the reason why I don't do that is because one of the things I found in my previous elected role is that sometimes when you do that, you get caught up because you may say, I'm going to vote this way, and then you get new information that forces you to reevaluate and change your mind. So then if you have to vote different from how you said you're going to vote, you look like you flip-flopped at that point. So strategically for me, I found that it's generally better to not telegraph your vote and just let things play out. To go to the other part of what you're talking about is, the approach I generally tend to take is I don't go in there with an agenda. Sometimes I've seen certain elected officials who will go in with an agenda. They got like an axe to grind, or they may take an approach of, I'm going to vote against this because I don't like the mayor, or I don't like that council member. The approach I generally tend to take, and this may be why my votes sometimes seem unpredictable, is if I think something makes sense, I'll vote for it. If I think it doesn't make sense, I'm going to vote no on it.
And finally, as we end this interview, when you look at the city council, this council has produced great leaders, from the Amy Hendersons and so forth that have come through, leaders in this city. Looking at the current council and looking at where we are, do you think, when you describe the Detroit City Council at present, has it lost its fervor? Has it lost that historical, has it lost that historical background, if you will, that it came out of?
Well, the one thing...
you can't compare the City Council to the council of the 70s or the 80s.
Well, I think every decade and every generation is going to have its own council that will reflect in some ways that particular generation. The approach I've generally tended to take when I've been on city council is, first off, I'm a member of a legislative branch, so I should be writing and passing legislation. And that's what I've tried to do in my 16 years. So I've passed things like the prompt payment ordinance, which supports small businesses by making sure they get paid on time. I've passed ordinances that regulate liquor stores and pawn shops and group homes and communities. I've also passed more recently 2 ordinances which seek to expand job opportunities for ex-felons so that they can come into our community and get gainful employment, not be in a situation where they have to go back to committing crimes. I think this council right now is a very strong council. It's solid, and I think it tends to get a bad rap in some cases. There's no crazies on this council and there's no dummies on this council. And I think it's done some good work that in some cases has been underappreciated.
Ken Cockrel Jr. on the record? You decide. Thank you very much, Councilman Ken Cockrel.
No problem.
For the best in African American news, it's Michigan Chronicle Online TV.